The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everyone. We're a little hiccups with our audio tonight, but hopefully you can all hear me. You should have a chat box on the side where if something comes up and you wish to ask a question about it, feel free to type it in. If we don't get to all those questions tonight, then we will certainly answer them by email. Topic tonight obviously is selling an option and what's involved. I think many of us listening to this broadcast would have come through the early days of the club where the advice was to never sell. And I would still say that that is the way to go. But I think in our current climate and the changes in lending over the years, I think selling is very much an option. So I'm just going to start by reviewing what we talked about in the last webinar. And if you didn't listen to the last PMC webinar, you can get the link from your PM. And my suggestion would be, if possible, hold on to your property. Do you know from lots of independent sources, a guy called Michael Yardney says that over the last 40 years, research shows that property in capital cities, the major capital cities, has doubled every 10 years. Now we know recently that hasn't been the case in some areas, but that applies not to Hobart or Darwin, only because they haven't had the records for that long, but for the other capital cities, it is the case. Now, if you had not much growth in the last 10 years, I can see you sitting there at your computer saying, oh, yeah, Jill. But the historical records don't lie. So if you have the potential to hold your property, that would always be my suggestion. And I read an article the other day where it said, ask your parents what they paid for their property and you'll find the growth comes eventually, not always as quickly as we would like. But I just want to remind you that rental losses do not necessarily equal cash losses. Okay, non-cash expenses allow your property to remain negatively geared while being cash flow positive. We went through some sheets on this last webinar, so if you didn't see it, as I said, ask for a copy of that. And higher rental return on investment does not always equal a better result. We all know that we originally got into this concept of using property to create wealth because of capital growth, not so much the rental situation. So I just want to look at, firstly, review approaches to retirement. And if you look at the purple heading up there, retired versus retire. And when I stopped work 14 years ago now, a friend of mine said, if you look at the word retired, it means you're tired. You're sick of what you're doing, you want to stop. And she said to me, I know you're just retiring. In other words, you're looking for other challenges and moving on to other things. So I think that's very important to consider. The average age of retirement is 65 today. It seems to be perhaps getting younger and younger. And I've deliberately put in this slide the life expectancy. In 2020, males 85 years, females 87 years. So you have to look at your age and work out what's going to happen from there. And we're all very different, and what we want and what we need in retirement will be different for every person here. And that's why it's so important you sit down and talk to a variety of people, whether it be your accountant, your financial planner, your property mentor, particularly if you've got multiple properties, and even to the point of getting them all together. I think I've mentioned before, we've done that for members. Got together with their accountant, their financial planner, and worked out a plan with them. But I thought this was very interesting that the research shows that most people, if they retire at 65, they have an active lifestyle of 10 years. And that means when you're fit and healthy and you pretty well do whatever you want to do, whether it's traveling, whether it's hiking, whether it's maybe volunteering within your community, but it's what you choose to do. But you're fit and well and healthy enough to do it. And for most people, that is 10 years. And I look at Bevan and I, he's been retired 15 years and I've been retired 14 years. So we would put 20 active years on that lifestyle, currently being in our 70s. Passive lifestyle is where maybe your health is not as great, so you're not able to hitch up that caravan. You're not able to manage the tours in foreign countries as much. So your lifestyle tends to become more local, shall we say. And then the frail years is when you're not really able to look after yourself. Apparently that for the average person, that's about 3 years, but it can go out to 5. If you add those together, you've got 25 years, which is pretty well, if you retire at 60, 65, take you to the current life expectancy. So I think that's very important. And we learnt this information from a financial planner. And if you want some recommendations, we can certainly pass them on to you. So the big decision is, what do you want to do with your life? And that may decide what you want to do with your property. Because you may remember in the last webinar I said the 95% of people live between 60,000 and 80,000 in retirement. Okay, so where's that money going to come from? Is it coming from your super? Is it coming from your savings? Is it coming from rent, from property that are positively geared? Is it coming from selling properties? Is it hobbies that might make an income? And I've certainly found that in my netball career at different times. The other thing is, I would say, never say you're retired to a lender. We were taught in the very early days of the club, probably 20 years ago, when we were both teachers, that we put on our tax returns that we were teachers / property investors. And now that we're retired from teaching, our tax return every year says property investors. So we've established who we are and what we do with the ATO. For those of you still putting in tax returns, it might be a good idea to add that to what your choice is. The other thing is, retirement doesn't mean suddenly stopping work. You might do some part-time work. You might change direction totally. Bevan did that. He left teaching and then he had 8 years with an engineering firm and then still being retired 15 years. So you could imagine in our case, having retired 14 to 15 years, we've eaten very much into our savings. So for us has come the time where we've needed to look at selling our portfolio, or at least some of the properties in our portfolio. So you just need to look at your cash flow for retirement. If you look over here on this diagram, we've got inflows. That's money coming in. From your property, you've got rents. You may have deductions with the ATO if you run a business, and you might be currently co-contributing to hold your properties. And Bevan and I, even at this stage, are doing that with some of our properties. And I have to say to you, that's what's become challenging for us, because we are no longer in a position to refinance. We talked about that last week. What costs have you got going out? Costs for your home and your cash expenses, which have to come from cash, whether it be from offset accounts, from your savings, maybe money you've got in your super that you can access because of your age. And then your outflows. And costs to hold the property are often which cause people to look at their properties and think about selling them. Just have to go to the next. Look, I've put this chart up, which I personally got from Wendy Priestley, who many of you listening tonight will know. And it's just a little table that Wendy drew up about keeping track of where your properties are. And I certainly have done this on an Excel spreadsheet, but this is good for just some rough notes. So what did you purchase your property for? What's been the growth in your property? Or I'm sure some of you might be listening, haven't had much growth in your property if you only bought them in the last 10 years. What's your net rental return? That means after all of your expenses. What's your loan payout? Because it's not just the amount you owe to the bank, there's costs to pay out a loan. The capital gain tax amount. Are you going to make a gain on this property or are you going to make a loss? Because that will affect the end result of how much cash you finish with in your pocket. Is your property that you're looking to sell fixed or variable? Remember, if it's fixed, there will be payout fees for breaking a fix. And that might be a factor in whether you decide to fix or stay variable on properties over the next few years. What is your interest rates? That's all a factor. Are they crossed or standalone? We don't hear a lot about these days, but we're always taught keeping every individual property standalone loan. That means the only security for that property is that particular property. It's not crossed to another property or your home. And if you're not sure of that, you need to look up your contracts. The only name on the contract should be the property that you are purchasing. If your home appears on the contract, then the bank will have crossed you. And that's the last thing you want at this stage. The availability of the property for sale, and I'll explain that a little bit more. The cost to bring the property to market, and obviously we'll look at that, and the state of the market. We'll look at all those things a little bit further in the presentation. If you aren't aware of this program, then you probably need to talk to your property mentor, or I can send it to you. Property management program. It's one of the best programs that the club has created. And as we're only 2 months into the new financial year, if you haven't used it, then it's probably an ideal time to start with it. You can see that all the expenses over here under the expense tab of all the expenses that are involved in holding a property. And you can put that in for each property. There's an income here, your rental income, any other income you might get, and your non-cash deductions. That's your borrowing expenses, your capital allowance for your building write-off, which is over 40 years, and the depreciation on plant. Now, they're things that usually on an average are written off within 10 years. If you replace them like an air conditioner, then you can start depreciating them again. And on the next slide is what one of those sheets, when you go further into the program, look like. So here, property one, you type in the name of the property, and then you can put in the details as they come in each month. And that way you can calculate your total costs at the end. And your accountant will love you. So you can either ask me and I'll send you a copy of this program, or ask your property mentor if you don't have one. But certainly an excellent way of having an overview of what your properties cost, as well as looking at your tax returns. So after looking at all this, what might be some of the reasons for selling? And for Bevan and I, it certainly is to maintain our lifestyle. I would always say that not all our properties currently are cash flow positive, even at our stage with our portfolio, but we've had the most fantastic lifestyle in the last probably 20 years, and we want to maintain that lifestyle. So for us, that's a reason for starting to sell down our portfolio. And we don't have serviceability to gain equity or change lenders. We certainly upstamped our properties, took all the equity we could get out of our properties when we could. And obviously many of you know that, and I'm sure have done it yourselves if you're an experienced PMC member and have been active in attending webinars and functions over the years. The other thing is your inability to hold the property. We personally have one property that is very negatively geared, and we do not have the cash reserves to continually be putting in to hold that property. So the option is to sell it. And when we do sell that property, if we sell it over the next couple of years, it will be at a loss. And I'll talk about that, selling properties at losses or a profit, in a moment. The other thing is changes by your lender to P&I. We've had so much about this from Kevin and also from our banks, and it certainly is challenging. At our height of P&I, we had 4 properties at P&I. And because we had been very diligent in renewing our interest only and changing lenders, when it came to having to pay P&I, our principal component was very large. Because remember, if you have a loan, a 30-year loan, and you've managed to have interest only for 15 years, then the amount of that loan, instead of being paid back over 30 years, has to be paid back over 15 years. And that is a huge a cost out of your savings at this stage where you're no longer working. When you're working, I don't believe it's a problem. It's about retirement that we're talking about. The age of the property and the owner. So if we look back to that active life, and Bevan and I are in our mid-70s, it's the age of the owner that is causing us to sell. Because as I said, we wish to continue the lifestyle. Or for some of you thinking about this, and you may only just be retiring or planning retiring, you need to think about what you want to do. And remember, 25, 30 years is a long time to support yourself without the help of the government. The other thing is the age of the property, because as your properties age, you will need to spend money on your property, whether it's replacing carpets, whether it's repainting, whether it's replacing items inside your property, particularly if it's a furnished property, you'll have to keep updating that furniture. So there are extra costs. They're tax deductible, and that's fabulous. But when you're not earning an income, then you can't claim them. So that's another factor to consider. Downsizing our portfolio. I think a lot of people will find as they get older, it's a lot of work to manage a large property portfolio, and it really is a business. Wendy has always said that. It's a business. A lot of people don't treat it as a business, but it is. And as you get older, you may decide that you don't want to spend a lot of time on your portfolio, so you start to downsize. The other thing is you want to look at possibly selling at the top of the market. Now, we all know at the moment with COVID that there is no top of the market. Property in every state has not been hit as severely as we think. Less than 0.5% has been the drop at this stage. Property is expected to drop a little bit further, but nothing dramatic. And people are still buying and people are still selling. These are two very much considerations that you need to think about if you're selling, and that's the depreciation clawback. I mentioned this in the last webinar about that the ATO over these years, and remember Bevan and I have had some properties for 22 years, and we've claimed those deductions every year in depreciation. Now, when you go to sell the property, it's what's called a depreciation clawback, and the government want that money back. Okay, so what they do is in their calculations, they add that to the selling price so that the gap is not the cash you expect to get. I'm going to explain that a little bit further. And the other thing is capital gains tax. If you sell a property at a profit, then the government wants you to pay tax on 50% of that profit. So there isn't the money in your properties that you initially think there is. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about capital gains tax because it's tricky for people to understand. Firstly, I want you to know that your own home is exempt from capital gains tax. Now, some people have moved away from their home and rented it out for a couple of years. If you move back within 6 years of selling, then you are able to consider it as your own home, and it's exempt from capital gain if you sell it, okay? I talked to some what I consider very clever members last week who are looking to move, and they bought a property 3 times the value of their own home. They're young, they're only in their 50s, so that eventually when they sell that home, when they decide to move on, that's exempt from capital gain tax, and they will keep all the profit from that home. If you're young enough, certainly something to think about, upgrading your home. If it's an investment property, your capital gains tax is calculated from the date of purchase on the contract. Now, a lot of people think it's the date they settle, but that's not the case. It's from the date of contract, and that may be very significant for you. So if you bought an off-plan property, you might have signed the contract, say, in 2005, but the property wasn't built and earning you money till 2006 or 7. But capital gains is calculated from the date of purchase contract. If you move into an investment property as your principal place of residence, so you might decide, oh, I'm going to live up in Queensland and live in one of my properties, then capital gains tax is calculated pro rata. Now, with all of what I'm saying here, you would never act on it. You would need to discuss this with your accountant. But this is a broad outline of how it's been explained to us. So the bottom line is, if you make capital gains tax, but you sell your property for less than you would like, there won't be as much capital gains tax, so you won't have to pay as much tax. So you've got to weigh all those things up. I've mentioned capital gains tax is only payable on 50% of the profit. So if you have a profit of $400,000 on the sale of your property, I think we'd all like that, then only $200,000 of it is subject to capital gains tax. And that 50% is split between the ownership of the property. So if you own your property as joint tenants 50-50, then it's 50% of the profit. So we bought a property, we made a profit, of 400,000, so we have to pay tax on 200,000 of it. We own that property 50-50, so 100,000 each. And that is added to your taxable income for that year, which in that case would take you into a different tax bracket. So that obviously needs to be discussed with your accountant. Now, this is the reduction of capital gains tax based on stored tax credits. So if you haven't been paying tax, and Bevan and I, through our property investing, were able in 2000, the year 2000, so that's 20 years ago, reduce our tax to zero. In other words, we haven't paid tax, income tax, for the last 20 years. So we weren't able to declaim that depreciation against our tax, but we did claim it, and it's stored as tax credits. Now, tax credits store for your life. You'll notice the last point. They're available till the end of the financial year of your death. And unfortunately, Wendy explained that to us. John, her first husband, died in July. She had 11 months to sell property and claim those credits. So it's very much a discussion you need to have and understand with your accountant. Okay, so if you sell a property and you're earning very good income, the gain from that property will be added to your income for that year of sale, and then you'll pay tax accordingly on that. We had friends who sold in Sydney, and their capital gain tax they had to pay to the government in that financial year was $60,000. So certainly something you very seriously need to consider. So how did we decide what property we were going to sell? Remembering that we have 11 properties when we finished our purchasing, we looked at our portfolio spreadsheet to assess our options. Now, you could use that property management program sheet that I showed you earlier. I have a spreadsheet which I showed you last webinar and sent out to members who requested it. Okay, you might have your own, I'm thinking most of you. We had this property, it's a Robina property up in Queensland, and it changed to P&I, and we didn't have any serviceability to refinance to another lender. And as I said, we had 4 properties at P&I, so it was probably the straw that broke the camel's back, which caused us to look at, we're going to have to sell something. The loan expiry date. So this particular property only had 2 years left before we would have to try and refinance, and we knew we wouldn't be able to, and then we would have to sell it. So we wanted to sell it on our terms. So your loan expiry date of each of your loans, of either interest only or P&I, are very significant. How much equity did we have in the property? Because remember, Bevan and I were looking for lifestyle. So we wanted to sell a property that had grown. And I'm going to show you the figures for this property in a moment. And it had nearly doubled. So we were happy with that. Where was the property in the property cycle? And when we sold this property in Southeast Queensland was heading to the top of the market. So it was between about 8 and 9 on the property clock. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm going to run another webinar on the property cycle. But I'm thinking if you're PMC members, a lot of you should know about the property clock. What did we have in the way of stored credits? Because remember, we'd been storing tax credits for quite a few years. Okay, so we were going to be able to use them when we sell to minimise our capital gains tax. What were the costs to sell this property? because most people forget that. They think, oh, this property is worth 400,000. I'm going to sell it for 600. I'm going to get 200,000. There's quite a lot of costs involved in selling a property, and you have to have those up front, some of them. Okay. And of course, we sat down with our accountant and we drew up a plan of what order to sell our properties in order to minimise the capital gains tax that we would pay. And we've done that with our accountant to the point we believe if we can sell in the right order and at the right time, that we will pay minimal, if any, capital gains tax. Which should tell you two things. We've got properties that we're going to sell at a loss, we've got properties we'll sell at a gain, and we've got stored tax credits which will help us with that. However, I have to say, like many of you, COVID's thrown quite a spanner in the works, plus the lack of growth in property in the last few years. But we can only control what we can control. So there's lots of questions for you to ask your accountant. Is the year of sale a consideration? In other words, do I sell in the first half of the year, which would, if I sold last year, it would be in the 19-20 year. If I sell now, today, I'm in the 2021 year. And that might be quite a factor for you. So it's certainly something you need to sit around the table and discuss with your agent. Your income from the financial year of sale. If you were looking, if you had retired last year and you don't have any income then this year, then now might be the time to sell a property because it will replace your income and minimise your capital gains tax. So very much a factor. Capital gains tax, I think we've discussed, is from the date of contract of when you purchase the property, not the completion or settlement of the property. What can I claim back from purchase costs? I'm thinking we must just about need to run a webinar on what sort of records are you keeping. We were always taught to keep a perpetual folder and an annual folder. So in my perpetual folder, I have all the things to do with purchasing the property. So when I sell it, I'm going to need that to give to my accountant. They're going to want that information. And then we keep an annual folder, which each year we move away into our tax records. But that's a story for another time. What ownership? Bevan and I own properties in different ownership. Not all of our ownership is 50-50. So that may be a factor for you. We own some 90-10. We own some 75-30, 25. So depending when you sell, that might be a factor. And the clawback, the depreciation clawback, of course, in some properties will be huge. The order of sale, now this is very important. If you are selling a property with a loss, your loss will store, okay? But you must sell your losses before your gains because say you have stored losses, but you've sold all your profitable properties, what are you going to write those losses off against? You won't have anything. But remember, stored tax losses can be used to write off any capital gain, not just property. It might be the sale of shares. We've used it to sell shares and not paid any capital gain because we had stored tax credits. So very important you understand this with your accountant. So we made the decision in 2018, was our first property to sell, and I have to tell you it was a challenge because we'd owned this property for 15 years and we'd become attached to them like you always do if you've got a lot of property. The other factor was that I thought I'd just go through these figures to give you some idea. We purchased this in 2015, for $215,000 in the year 2003. Okay, so we'd held it for 15 years and we sold it for $425,000 in 2018. So you could argue that we had a profit of $210,000. Now this property, and I don't need to go into the detail of why, but the ownership of this property was 73% Jill and 27% Bevan. So when it comes to capital gains, 73% of the sale gain is mine and 27% is Bevan. Now on a paper gain, we made a profit of $249,500. And if you do the figures, you say, Jill, that's not right. You only made $410,000 $8,000 on this property. We did in cash. But when the ATO added in the depreciation of clawback on this property, we had claimed over the years of 15 years of holding nearly $15,000 back. But we have to now pay that back to the government. And that's why depreciation clawback is a real factor in terms of how much cash you expect to keep with that property. Now, the profit, we had up to stored tax credits because this property was in a trust. I do need to mention that. So our total profit from the sale of the property was 292. So 200,000, just over 201,000, let's say. Okay. Now, capital gains tax had to be paid on half of that. So capital gains tax had to be paid on 100,000 based on the proportions of ownership. So if you like, roughly 73%, so 73,000 was going to be my income for that financial year, and we sold it in the 17-18 year, and 27,000 was added to Bevan's income. So that's added to our rental income, which is what we had. So there wasn't as much money there as we thought. Both of us had personal stored tax credits. Remember I said we hadn't been paying income tax since 2000, so we've got quite a lot of stored tax credits. So we were able to write off the capital gain. So we didn't have to pay capital gains tax on this property, which left us with round about 198,000, I think, because there's costs involved. You have to pay commission to the agent. I'm going to go through that in a minute. So it's about considering the position of your property in your portfolio. So that gave us enough extra cash to continue the lifestyle we wanted to lead. Remember I said in the beginning you have to decide why you're selling a property. Why do you need that money? Okay, so what you've decided you want to sell a property, you've talked to your accountant, you've worked out which property you want to sell. So how do you go about the marketing process? Firstly, you need to decide on a marketing price. And I have to tell you in most cases, we always think our properties are worth more than they are. So how do you find out the price? Ask your property mentor to provide you with an RP data valuation. All branch managers have access to this and they can send you an up-to-date one this month. So I'd certainly be asking my PM for that. Also, if you go to corelogic.com.au, they have a monthly update on valuations of properties around Australia. So that's good research for you to do. Ask your property manager. What do they think? A lot of them are real estate agents as well as property managers, and certainly your on-site manager would know. So these are all ways of finding out. Go onto realestate.com and look for listings of equivalent property and sales in your area. And then that will give you an indication of what the market will give you, because it's only what the market will give you. And you'll have to decide if what the market's offering, you want to go ahead with the sale. It's also the presentation of the property. In this particular property, within the last 18 months, we had put in new kitchen cupboards, new bench tops, patch and repair. Remember, this was a 15-year-old property. We did a full internal repaint because it was quite a dark colour, and the recommendation from our selling agent was to put in a neutral, almost an off-white, would make a huge difference. We put in new carpets. Now, I said to our agent, if I'm going to spend, we spent about $10,000 all up to get this property to market. I said, so am I going to get $10,000 more on the sale? And her comment was, not necessarily, but it will make it saleable. Good point to think about. The other thing is, we often get asked the question, do you wait till the end of a lease to put it on the market? I would say definitely not. We've sold another 2 properties since this property. We've always sold with our tenants in. However, this just happened to be the tenants were moving out, and I have to say our tenants were of a cultural background where they did a lot of cooking with oils, and the paintwork was terrible because there wasn't a flue in the kitchen. So it definitely needed a paint. So we took advantage of styling. We had furniture brought in. if you've got a clever agent, you might be able to do this by Photoshop. And I've heard of people selling like this. But we styled this property and the difference was amazing. It certainly increased the chance of selling. The other thing is, how did we decide on a selling agent? Most of you will know that when the market is a saleable market, you will start getting lots of letters or emails from agents in your area saying, are you interested in selling? And we found that had dropped off in the last 5 or 6 years. And then all of a sudden in 17, 18, we started to get this again for this Robina property. So we rang a couple of those agents, decided on one. We weren't happy with our on-site managers, so we didn't particularly want to use them as a selling agent. And we decided on an agent looking at basically what their database was. So how much exposure was this going to get to the market? We have another member who sold a property in Sydney because they felt the market was right. It went on the market in, I think it was October, and after a few weeks, the agent said, I believe there's been a bit of a drop in the market in Sydney. I think we should take it off. So they did, and they waited 3 months till they put it back on, and it sold in 2 weeks. Now that's a clever agent. So make sure you discuss things with your agent. The other thing is, how do you choose a conveyancer? You won't need a conveyancer till you get a contract. The selling agent can recommend a conveyancer, or we went back to the conveyancers we'd used when we were purchasing the property, and we found them, in particular the one we'd used in Queensland, was very good. So you only need your conveyancer once you've got a signed contract. So points, what do you discuss with your agent? As I mentioned, it's the database exposure, which is very important. Well, how are you going to market it? All these items are listed in your contract of sale. Because this was a Queensland property, we chose a Form 6 and a commission to the agent. On the 3 properties we've sold, the commission has been different, but we sold one in Cairns, one in Queensland and one in Melbourne. The commissions were all different, but in every case we were able to reduce the commission to what the agent originally put on the contract of sale. So remember that the commission is always negotiable. Now we're pretty well around about 2.5%. If you're selling for 400,000, then your commission is going to be 10, 12,000 out of your profit. So remember that. It's going to cost you to take the property to market. The other thing is, what costs are there? Well, professional photography. They will want a photographer to go in and take photos, and when in our Melbourne property that we sold, we didn't think they were quite appropriate enough, so they took them again. Professional floor plans have to be drawn to put it up. These days they use drone shots of the outside of the complex if it's in a complex. You have to pay to list it on realestate.com, and sometimes in Melbourne there's an option with some agents to list it on a particular Chinese marketing website because they are very large purchasers in the Melbourne market. Signboards. Now for some properties that's not so appropriate to have it outside. Social media is becoming huge in terms of selling property, and open home brochures. And we've just put another couple on the market, and currently they tend to be digital rather than a physical brochure to hand out. And of course there has to be some expectation of local marketing. What's their presence in the local market? So all of these are points that you need to probably discuss with your agent. I've mentioned most of these. Direct costs to sell. There'll be costs for all of these factors. Your conveyancer fees. You'd expect to pay about $1,000 to your conveyancer for selling. You've got searches. You'll need a body corporate search. If there's a swimming pool, there's other searches. They all are upfront costs. Usually with your conveyancer you have to pay maybe a quarter of the fee and the rest at the completion at settlement. Your agent commission is always paid at settlement. You're going to have to pay out your loan, and it might cost you $500 to $1,000 to pay out your loan. Remember what I said about a variable rate and a fixed rate? If you're breaking a fixed loan, it'll cost you a lot more than that. Okay? There are settlement costs because the rates, the body corporate, all of that has to be prorated at settlement. And you don't need to remember to cancel your insurance policy. I'm going a little bit faster now because I need to be off within the next 5 minutes because we had a clash of webinars tonight, a little bit of misorganisation. Don't forget to cancel insurance policy from the date of settlement. The other thing is with this particular property, we had the purchaser was unable to settle on the day of settlement because their bank wasn't ready. Now, selling is very different from buying. We asked our conveyancer to claim so much a day for the delay in settlement, which was 2 weeks. The other thing is that our purchasers wanted to move in, so they did move in and they paid us rent while they were in there till settlement happened. So there's quite a lot of other options there. So you've sold this property, what are you going to do with the surplus funds? A lot of people don't necessarily know what to do. We've chosen every time to put them in our offset accounts till we make decisions about where they want to go. I personally wouldn't pay down a line of credit because I think that line of credit is great to stay open. We know members that have totally paid out a loan but left $10 there to keep their line of credit open. Because remember, we are no longer able to borrow, so that line of credit could be like our buffer. It might be 100,000, it's just sitting there, you're not paying any interest on it. So that could be one of the options. You might be wanting to invest it somewhere else and get a return on your funds, which with current low interest rates might be better than having it in an offset account. Or you may choose to pay down another property and have several freehold properties in your portfolio. To me, that would be the ideal. Pay down some of your property and keep some of your portfolio. You must remember that you do need to resubmit your tax variation because it will alter if you're still in the workforce and you sell a property. It will be different because you won't have the same tax deductions. So it concludes our presentation for tonight. Hopefully you've gained some knowledge into selling, because when we first sold the first property in 2018, it was a real journey for us because we didn't really know which way to go. Now, I'm just going to see if we've any questions online tonight. Yep, we do have some questions here. Can please send a copy of the program? Yep, lots of questions there. I think most of them are individual ones. I've just got them up there. No, I'm going to answer this one. So you must live in your home for 6 years for it to be exempt from capital gains tax? No, your home is always exempt from capital gains tax unless you've moved away. You might have lived somewhere else for 2 or 3 years. If you move back in within 6 years, it's the same. Okay, but no, it's always capital gain tax free if you live in that home always. How is it possible not to have any income tax? Well, if you remember, Bevan and I had bought enough property. By our 4th property, we had enough tax deductions in depreciation to wipe off paying income tax. You probably need to talk to your accountant about that. Yep, you will get a copy of the same. Look, I'm going to have to leave those questions for the moment because I know I have to get off because there's another webinar starting. And if you've only into your 1st or 2nd property, you might like to listen to the next webinar, which is a YIC webinar, but it's about how to build your portfolio. And I'd just like to finish with, I spoke to a member the other day who intends to have his portfolio built by 45. He is laughing. The problem with people like ourselves is that we're older and the market is not good. So that's why we sometimes need to sell down. So look, thank you for listening tonight. Hopefully you've learned something. Feel free to email if you haven't asked a question but still have one, and I will answer all these questions individually by email. So until our next webinar, good luck with your property investing and you to learn. Good night.